Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Aerobility Inspirability. It's about 2 weeks now since the amazing Armchair Air Show, and the dust is settling. And we've had a couple of weeks to wind down from our last huge online event. Thanks for those that came along; it really was great fun, and I hope you all enjoyed it. But it gives me real pleasure to very shortly hand you over to Harvey Matthewson, an Aerobility Flyer, and today's host for our special guest today. But just before I hand over to Harvey, I just wanted to say it's a real pleasure to introduce our guest today. He's been a fabulous volunteer for the charity. He's been a great friend, and he's been a fabulous instructor and encouraged so many people to fly in it. But a really experienced aviator with a great story to tell. So got some great stories, I know. So really looking forward to today, just to sit back and hear about a life of flying, and lots more flying to come in the future as well. But also, it really would be great if you would consider visiting our virtual mobility Just Giving page, just to help us and support us during these crazy times. So if you do, follow the link underneath, and we'll put it on screen during the talk, where you can make a donation of just a few pounds to support this program. That'd be much appreciated. So I'm now going to bring Harvey onto the screen. Harvey is one of our flyers, as many of you know. Harvey, good afternoon. How are you doing?
Afternoon, I'm good. Cheers, Mike. How are you?
Very good, thank you. I'm really pleased that we got Inspirability back again.
Yeah, and such a great guest. I mean, you were talking about Nick inspiring people to fly, and he after so many years in the industry, he still pulled passion for aviation, which I think makes him so special.
Absolutely. Well, should we bring him onto the screen?
We might as well, I think.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. I don't know how I'm going to follow that
now. Afternoon. We were just talking about you, actually.
I just noticed that, yeah.
But Harvey, I'll leave you to introduce Nick. Have fun.
Cheers, Mike. Cool. Hey, Nick, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks, Harvey. I'm very happy to be here. So, yeah, I hope I can live up to your introduction.
Well, we are very happy to have you. So, Nick, you're an executive jet captain, or at least were. Your progress into aviation was just quite different, and I think that makes it extraordinary. And you're also a very valued airability volunteer. So it's great to have you on the show. And like many of us, you catch the aviation bug quite young. How did you become first fascinated with aviation?
Well, right from the very beginning, I was born into an airline family. My father was an apprentice engineer with Imperial Airways before the Second World War. And when he came back from the war, he became a chief steward flying with BOAC. So from very earliest times, I've grown up around the airport and with airplanes around. It was interesting, though, that I had two brothers, and being what I'd call a BOAC family, I suppose. We all went in as we grew up and we left school. We all joined BOAC, including my mother. And we were all as a family really interested in traveling. But I was the only one that was really interested in the flying side of things. It was the aeroplanes that fascinated me, although I did enjoy the traveling as well. So that was my origin for it.
That's really great, and I think it's amazing that everyone in the industry sort of gets into it from a young age. But as said, your journey to the cockpit was a bit delayed. It wasn't the normal training and straight into the pilot seat. You actually started off in BOAC telephone sales before in 1972 moving to flight operations and ground handling for British Airways. what steered you towards taking that route?
Well, when I was at school, I always wanted to fly, and at the time there weren't that many sponsored flying training facilities around. There was the Air Training College at Hamble, which fed pilots into British Airways or BIC and BEA, and there was the Air Force, of course. But there was so much competition. I've got to admit, I was probably slightly lazy academically as well, so I was slightly intimidated when I went for the interviews for these places by all these guys that seemed to be so confident and know where they were going and know what they were doing. And I thought, I can't compete here. I was probably underconfident at the time, but I thought, well, I've got to get into the airport. I've got to get into the industry. So I just went into BIC, and that's where I started, on the telephone sales department. And then I just progressed through various departments. And I ended up down at Heathrow, working in the flight operations department, which then brought me into line with the whole operation, with pilots, with flight planning and all sorts of aspects like that. And then by almost like, my life seems to have run by pure lucky chances. I fell into a job almost by accident, which was ground handling for private and VIP flights. I got through the interview process for that, and that was the first time it brought me into direct contact with aeroplanes and pilots and passengers, and we actually provided a whole package of ground handling, and it was such a good grounding for me for an aviation career. So that as I progressed through that, I was there in that department for about 19 years altogether. And we were part of British Airways, so I had the benefit of being employed by British Airways and a really strong, airline behind me. But we were a small department, and we were pretty much left alone to get on with things. As long as we didn't upset the apple cart with the main airline, we just got on with it, and we were just left free to do it. But that really got the bug to me, and that was the first time that I thought that I would then have the possibility to fly. And initially I thought, no, well, I'll get myself a private pilot's license, so at least I'll be able to experience flying. And that's where it all started. And by then I was in my 30s. And, and that was my only plan at that time, was to just get myself a PPL and then see how we go from there.
Yeah. And it all worked out in the end. But working at British Airways Executive, it must have put you in that line of fire of very many interesting and maybe even famous people. Did you have a favourite personality that you saw regularly and enjoyed seeing?
Oh, well, yeah, I could dish the dirt and tell you some really stories of the awful ones, but no, I mean, I like to think positively. And yeah, actually, I think probably my favourite celebrity I ever met was Danny DeVito. And I had to meet him from a flight, and he'd just coming from Tokyo. He'd flown into Heathrow from Tokyo, and he was being taken by helicopter to go and meet Prince Charles, I think. And I thought, well, he's probably going to be grumpy. And he came off this flight, and it was a typical, it was the furthest gate, so we had to walk all the way through the terminal to get to immigration and customs. And of course, he was instantly recognizable. And so people were almost mobbing him all the way. And I was, doing my best to keep it all moving. But he stopped and spoke to everybody that spoke to him. He stopped to have photographs taken with people. And he did it all so cheerfully. And to the extent when we came out of customs, there was a little boy waiting to, I think, probably meet his mum. He was with his dad. And he said to his dad, "Oh, Dad, there's Danny DeVito." And his dad said, "Oh, look, he's a big Hollywood star. Don't bother him, son, And as we came round the corner where all the crowds were waiting, I looked round, he'd gone. I thought, where's he gone? And he'd clocked this little boy. He dived into the crowd. And when I found him, he was kneeling down, chatting to this little boy. And when I got him away, I said, "Come on, we've got a flight to catch here, And we were walking back towards the car. And I said, "I don't know how you do it. You're just so nice to everybody." And he said, even after all this time, he said, "I'm just a little kid from Brooklyn." He said, "I've got no real skills." He said, "And I still really appreciate that people want to talk to me." And I just thought he had such a lovely attitude to life, So
that's a brilliant story. And I know even though Danny DeVito might be the nicest, he
yeah.
wasn't the most eventful customer you ever had. I heard that there's a story about a US president and an aircraft tire which kept you busy for a couple of hours whilst working
Oh,
at it.
yeah. Yes, we had. It was at the time. It was President Jimmy Carter, and it was at the time he just ceased to be the president, and he was taking up quite a lot of roles in fighting disease in sort of parts of Africa, and he was ambassador to the UN and that sort of thing. And he was doing a tour down in Ethiopia and Sudan, I think, but he was using a private executive Boeing 727. Which was being provided to him by a Middle Eastern bank. And so I was dispatching the flight and chatting with the captain. It turned out that one of the wheels had been damaged, or one of the tires had been damaged on landing. And the captain looked at it and said, "We can't fly with that, especially going down to Ethiopia." So we hit the phones, I got back to the office, and we were calling everybody that might have a Boeing 727 wheel and tire assembly. And it was at the time when the 727 wasn't being used that much as an airliner. It was when the Airbuses and the 737s were coming in. So we couldn't find a tire until we eventually, one of my colleagues, Jeff Perry, he managed to get hold of the engineering supervisor at a very well-known French airline. And this chap said, "Oh yes, we've got a wheel and tire assembly in the store." Jeff said, "Oh great, can we have it?" And he said, "No." So he said, "But you're not even operating 727s into Heathrow." He said, "We can replace it by tomorrow, but this aircraft's grounded and it'll be a 24-hour delay." And this chap was just adamant. I mean, I don't know whether he just had just didn't really like private jets or something. But anyway, he was adamant that we couldn't have this wheel and tire assembly. So we were arranging to get one shipped in from the US, which would have then taken probably 24 hours to do. Meanwhile, of course, departure time was getting closer and the passengers were turning up, and he turned up in a great stretched Lincoln limousine with flags on the front and police outriders. I mean, he was very big news at the time, and he turned up at the VIP suite. So I was, being the dispatcher of the flight, I was sent round to let the VIP people know. So I explained the situation to them, and of course, one thing about people that deal with VIPs, they don't like giving bad news. So the VIP man said to me, "Well, you know what's happening. You better go in and tell him." So I was wheeled into the great man who was sitting there with his wife drinking his coffee. And I always believe if there's bad news, don't pussyfoot around. Just give it to him straight. So I just told him in words of one syllable, pretty much, the situation, and that it was going to be a 24-hour delay. And he just sat looking at me, didn't really sort of say much while I was talking. And I ran out of things to say. So he then just looked at me and very quietly, he just said, "Where's the man with the wheel?" So I said, "Oh, he's in an office not very far away." He said, "Will you take me to him?" I said, "Yes, certainly." So up he got, and the two of us, we walked out, and he got into this limousine. And so I got into my British Airways car and just started to drive around the airside roads towards this airline engineering office. And it was shared, the office was shared by the ramp handlers, so the baggage loaders, the pushback drivers, and the engineers. So we pulled up in this limousine outside the office. But to get to speak to the supervisor, we had to actually go into the ramp workers' restroom. And, you can imagine what a ramp worker's restroom is. I mean, it's just pretty mucky and, coffee cups on the table, men sitting there reading the Sun newspaper, fang in his mouth, And we walked in, and it was just like John Wayne walking into the saloon. The whole place just went so quiet. And the supervisor sat in a little office at the far end. It's a separate office, but he used to speak to the workers through like a post office sort of grill. But we had to walk, just Jimmy and me, just the two of us, walked the length of this room in silence. And the chap could see us coming, and his eyes were like saucers. And when we got to him, Jimmy just bent down and he spoke spoke into the window and he said, "Are you the man with the wheel?" And this chap just went. He said, "Can I have it?" He said, "Thank you very much." And we just turned around, and the two of us walked out again. And sure enough, wheel turned up, and the job was done, and they were away within an hour and a half. But it was probably the most. I would say that's the single most surreal experience I had, with a well-known personality at Heathrow.
Yeah.
It was great. I really, thinking back on it now, I really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic story.
Yeah, but we had. I mean, the sort of people we dealt with. I mean, I was thinking about it after you were talking yesterday, and people like Henry Kissinger. Was a regular with us, and again, he was flying to the Middle East and dealing with the Palestinian crisis and all sorts of things like that. But in the time that he was crossing through Heathrow to transfer to go on the Concorde, we were having I had one-to-one time with the chap for 20 minutes at a time, and it was a real privilege, really. I mean, people like Henry Kissinger, Robert Maxwell, Rupert Murdoch, Yaga Khan, and it was just people like that. Became just regular customers. We were known as the chaps at Heathrow. And it really got me over this idea of being starstruck. So if I ever got to meet, celebrities, you realise that they're just people like anybody else, really.
And this is a skill which would come in handy later on in your career. And I'm sure we can talk about Heathrow all day, but I think people are here to really hear about you going after your dream. And as a little interlude to our viewers at home, if you do have any questions throughout this talk, chat them up, put them in the comments, and we'll try to get round to them at the end. But it's nice to see some comments coming in already.
Right.
It is your famous name. So Nick, things weren't destined to be at Heathrow forever. You did actually achieve what you set out to do. And that story started in 1985. Tell us a bit about your training all the way through, getting your CPL.
Yeah, well, as I said, my plan was to get a PPL, and of course we got reduced rates at the British Airways Flying Club up at Booker. So I joined the BA Flying Club and started flying training. But bearing in mind, by that time I was in my 30s, had a mortgage, had wife and two kids, so money was fairly tight. So I could only afford to do one lesson a month, and so that's how I started out. And of course, progress because of that was very slow. So that's why it took me over 2 years to get to the stage of being ready for my general flying test for the private pilot's license. And of course, as it got nearer to getting the license, then I did, sort of get together some more money and intensified the training. But I was very fortunate. I mean, again, I'm saying my whole life has been a series of happy accidents. But when it got to my test, I was tested by a chap called Tim Orchard, who was the chief flying instructor and examiner at the BA Flying Club at the time. And he and I knew each other anyway from working in the exec department. And he did my flying test for me, and we just got on very well together. And he was very encouraging, and he planted the idea. He said, well, you've gone this far. He said, you've got the aptitude. He said, you could go the whole way. He said, if you really applied yourself, you could get an ATPL. But he said, I won't lie to you. He said, it's a lot of work and it's not going to be easy. But with that encouragement, I thought about it, discussed it with my wife and family, and with their support, I got stuck in. But having got the PPL in those days, in order to get to the next stage, to get a commercial pilot's license, you had to have 700 hours logged in your logbook before you could even start taking any exams. So that was a pretty daunting prospect to build 700 flying hours and then move on to the next stage. But I had various wheezes in order to do that. Two things of significance happened at the time. One, that apart from being the chief flying instructor at the BA Flying Club, Tim was flying a Beech 300 King Air. I think Chad might have a picture of it at some stage that he might be able to pop up. And that was based at Booker. And it was mainly used to fly Lord King and the British Airways Board of Directors around. There it is. And that's parked at Heathrow outside the TBA maintenance area.
It's a brilliant looking machine.
Oh, it's fantastic, yeah. But a little while after I'd got my PPL, I had a phone call from Tim, and Lord King said he wanted to have two pilots, even though legally it was a single pilot operation. Lord King said, no, he'd rather have two pilots. So I didn't have to be a full commercial pilot to go and fly it privately. So Tim invited me to go and fly as the co-pilot on that aeroplane. And it was quite a daunting prospect. I mean, at that stage, I had a total time of, I think, 145 hours. And so I started flying right-hand seat on this aeroplane. And at the beginning, I mean, my main function was actually to put the wheels up and down and to make sure Lord King had his whiskey and his cheese board. But Tim was fantastic. I mean, he was so encouraging. And if we were doing any low-level VFR flying, he actually talked me through and taught me through my multi-engine rating, so that I could actually log VFR time when we were flying on the King Air. So you know, I got a lot of very good experience doing that. It was just incredible. I mean, I can't thank Tim enough for the help and encouragement he gave me. The other significant thing happened. I decided it was a lot cheaper and easier to go and fly in the USA, to rent like a Cessna 152, a small single-engined airplane, and to build the flying hours up. It was incredibly cheap in America to do that, and a lot more freedom as well, freedom of the airspace. And so through a friend I had in Houston, a girl called Hayden Swift Tyree, she set up for me to get my American private license. She put me up in her house. She set up a deal with a local flying club for me to rent their airplanes. And off I went. I went and stayed with her, and I spent some great times flying around the Houston area, and really enjoyed it, because all I had to do was fly. I needed to get these 700 hours. That's it. Well, this is the next stage, actually. That picture there. I was reading Pilot Magazine one day, and in the small ads in the back, personal ads, there was an ad, and it said, "Come to Chicago. Fly a Cessna 152, 15 pounds an hour wet," and it was quoted in pounds, not dollars, and it was, yeah, and so that meant 15 pounds an hour, including the fuel, free accommodation, and free pickup from O'Hare Airport. And reading it, I thought, it's got to be a scam.
Yeah,
it's too, when you say, oh, if it looks too good, it is. So I thought, well, I can get a free ticket to get over there on a standby ticket. If they say it's all free, so I'm going to go and try it for a few days and then just see how I get on with it, and then I'll find out what the scam is, and at least then I'll know. Sure enough, off I went, and when I got there, it was a place called Cushing Field in the cornfields of Illinois, and it was owned by a chap called Bud Cushing, who was a retired TWA pilot, and he was an absolute aviation nut. He just wanted to spread the joy of aviation around the world, so he put these small ads in magazines all around the world. And so when I got there, sure enough, I was picked up, taken to the airfield. It was about an hour's drive from O'Hare. And there was a big old-fashioned, the old-fashioned farmhouses in the States, wooden built with a veranda. It was one of those. And they just said, okay, well, you go in there, find yourself an empty bedroom, and that'll be your room while you're here. Very, very rough and ready. I mean, hygiene was a bit questionable, but you had a bathroom, you had a bed to sleep on. And it was amazing. I mean, I'd wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning, fall out of bed, get into the airplane, and there was an airfield about 10 minutes flying time away. We'd fly over there, and they did a $3 full American breakfast, and then get your maps out, plan what you're going to do for the day. And so at the end of that first week, got the bill. Sure enough, that was what it was, 15 pounds an hour, cheap as chips. And I said to Bud, you're going to have a lot of people in England that are going to be suspicious about this. So I've been here now. I've seen what the deal is. So if anybody from England is inquiring, then I'm happy if you give them my phone number, and then I'll just tell them, honestly, what I think of the place. and that was it. Well, when I got home, my phone rang off the hook. I mean, I could have up to a dozen calls a day from people inquiring about this. And I was very honest about the deal. The aircraft were they weren't new, they were quite old airplanes, but they were properly and well maintained. The place was a bit grubby, but it was great. It was very, very free and easy. And so I suppose because of these calls, and I was talking to people all the time about what the deal was, a lot of people, based on what I said, then went to Cushing and did their own hour building. And so a few times I got very friendly with Bud because I was going over there for my days off as often as I could get over there. And sometimes at the end of my flying week, I'd go to pay the bill and he'd say, "Oh no, it's okay, this week's on the house." And like eventually I needed to revalidate my multi-engine rating at some stage. And Bud had a really old beaten up Piper Apache. And so I just mentioned it in conversation to him one day that I've got to renew my multi-engine. Right, he said, "Come on." And he took me out to this old Apache and we did probably a good 2 hours flying in it and single engine work and all sorts. And again, at the end of that, he said, "That's all on the house." So again, a lucky break for me, but it made it affordable and it made it fun. You know, I used to sort of set myself tasks. How many different states can I land in one day? And from Illinois, you can actually get to quite a few different states, you know, within one day. I think the best I did was 6. But the other thing is, you know, it can be a daunting task just to fly around. People would get airborne and fly around in circles and be really bored and not really enjoy it. Every stage of my training and studying, I enjoyed it. You know, I'm a real sort of believer in this expression, you know, the journey is the destination. And I had a goal that I was working towards, but I definitely enjoyed the journey and the things I was doing along the way.
I think you got to, especially with a journey such as one into aviation, it can be difficult. So you got to enjoy the journey.
Yes.
But I mean, that opportunity to me just sounds like heaven. I think it might be a brewery away from being heaven for me. But yeah, absolutely brilliant. And you did get that. In 1993, you did your CPL training in Bournemouth, and that all went well. At that point, where you had your CPL, you were ready for work, did you know that you were onto a good career?
Well, not necessarily, but one of the things is that it took me probably about 12 years from a standing start to get my frozen ATPL, and I'd probably spent somewhere between £80,000 and £90,000 to do that, spread over that 12 years. So it was, bearable. But I know several people that were doing similar things to me at that time who spent that time and spent that money and never got a job at the end of it. Again, which is why I was saying earlier, I do seem to have had some lucky breaks. And I got really friendly while I was working in the executive aircraft unit at Heathrow. I got friendly with a chap called Nick Probert, who started his own company with a Piper Navajo Chieftain, little twin-engine propeller aircraft, which he based at Heathrow. He just landed at Heathrow and just didn't leave. He just kept it there. And I used to go and do a bit of pilot assistant work with him. I helped him run the operation when his wife went off to have a baby. And, he was a very, very go-getting sort of guy. And so we just hit it off. But he left Heathrow, and when Farnborough became more of an important sort of business aviation hub, he built the fleet up and ended up with a fleet of 7 jet airplanes. And this was parallel with me doing my training to get my ATPL, my frozen ATPL. And so when I finally, it all sort of came together that I got my IR test passed. So I had a frozen ATPL, instrument rating. British Airways were looking for staff to leave. So they were offering very generous severance packages. And Nick Probert and his company Chauffeur, based at Farnborough, well, they didn't actually have a space for me, but put it this way, Nick Probert created a space for me. And so I took my severance, took a good paycheck from British Airways. I had the weekend off, and the Monday morning I started working for Chauffeur, flying Citations and HS-125s. So, it was almost as though it was a master plan that had come together, but it all just fell into place pretty much at the right time.
Oh, it's brilliant. You've definitely got someone looking over you, Nick.
Well, I'm a great believer in being nice to people, and I'm a great believer in being proactive. And I think those things do help. When you're looking for a job, I think if you've got a license, it's kind of in the industry, it's a given that if you've managed to reach the standard to get a license, then your flying is not then sort of put into question. So the big thing when somebody's going to employ you is, am I going to want to spend 3 weeks down route staying in hotels with this guy? Are we going to get on together? And being amenable and being proactive, I think, is a big factor, particularly in business aviation, probably even more so than the airlines, where, on the airlines, you don't necessarily know the person you're flying with, but you've got, standard operating procedures, which everybody abides by, which is the same in business aviation, except that you tend to fly with the same people, for a long period. So you've got to get on pretty well together to make that work.
Yeah, and talk me through your first job at Chauffeur, Nick, and what was the citation like as an aircraft?
Well, to me, it was a real hot ship, of course. I mean, apart from, it was the first pure jet that I'd flown. Of course, the King Air, the Beechcraft, had jet engines, but the jet engines drove propellers. But the Citation, God, it was brilliant. I mean, I loved it. And in fact, it was quite funny that the deal was, because Nick Probert actually didn't need any new pilots, he agreed for me to go and fly the Citation. But my main job, as far as he was concerned, would be that I would be running or be involved in the operations office. Yeah. And his idea was that I'd be an ops guy, and my idea was that I'd be a pilot. So there was a bit of a clash which came at one point. But my very first trip, that's it. And that's the first aircraft I flew at Farnborough. But it was quite funny, actually, that I turned up at work in the ops office one morning at 9 o'clock, and the phone rang, and it was the accident investigation branch, and they were based at Farnborough, of course. And they said, look, we've got an aircraft has just landed at Manchester, and it's shed one of its undercarriage, and so it's blocking the runway. But we want to get an accident team up there, and we want to keep the aircraft on the runway so that we can have a look at it. So how quickly could you get an airplane airborne? So I thought, well, I was one of the pilots, so I could be there. I could do the flight plan. I could get the aircraft ready. I said, I reckon we could be ready for departure in 45 minutes. So they said, great. So I phoned one of the pilots, one of the captains, and I said, what are you doing, Tony? He said, I'm just vacuuming the stairs. I said, well, just don't put your uniform on anything. Just get in the car and drive to Farnborough and bring your flying bag. And sure enough, I mean, 45 minutes later, this accident team got on the airplane and we flew up to Manchester. And then we had to wait while they got the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. So we were stuck up there for about 4 hours until and we flew them back to Farnborough to do the investigation. So the office weren't very pleased with me because I'd left the ops office unmanned. But that was my very first trip in Chauffeur.
Oh, bro. It was a little bit of a baptism of fire there. Where did you land at Manchester? Did you land beyond the aircraft? Or?
No, we actually flew to Woodford, which is the British Aerospace Airport. Yeah, and then they got a car across. So, that worked out okay. But then, started flying the Citation initially. And after about a year, I then converted onto the HS-125 as well, which was a fantastic airplane to fly. Yeah, we had 3 HS-125s. And joyful. Did some brilliant trips, but we flew celebrities on there. But we did. I remember one of the most memorable trips I did was a 9-day trip to Egypt, where we flew to Cairo. Had about 3 days in Cairo. Then that's it. Yeah, that was on the 125. We flew down to Luxor. Had a few days in Luxor. Then we flew down to Aswan, and the positioning flights, because the passengers we had, they were doing a Nile cruise. So a lot of the flying within Egypt, we were empty, didn't have any passengers on. So we were just buzzing low level, flying along the river, along the Nile. And I did think, well, you don't get to do this as an airline pilot,
No, that's the thing. And you look extremely swish in that photo at the controls.
Yeah, it's lucky it's a bit fuzzy around the edges, isn't it? It was not very well focused, but
and Chauffeur obviously came to an end in 2002. Which, unfortunately, they went bust and you were left without a job. Was it difficult for you to get back into the cockpit after that?
Well, yes. I mean, it was a real shock, actually, that we were, everybody in the company, all the pilots and the cabin crew and the office ops guys, we were all brought into a big office, and we thought that we were going to be talked to about what cutbacks there'd be so that we could tighten the belt. And in fact, the Price Waterhouse Cooper man, as he shut the door, just said, right, as of this moment, you are all out of a job. And I thought, well, and there was no payoff. I mean, there was no redundancy pay, and still had the mortgage to pay at the end of the month. So it was a real shock. But it's no good, sort of crying into your beer, really, is it? So again, two things happened in fairly quick succession. For the previous couple of years, on my days off from chauffeur, I did a bit of freelance work for a company called Range Mile, who operated an HS-125 between Coventry and Genoa on a regular contract. It was like a shuttle service they did, and they used various freelance pilots. And once in a while, they'd be really stuck and really stranded. So, I'd be one of the people they'd ring up. And if I could help them out, then, extra bit of flying for me. I mean, what's not to like? So if I could help them out, I would do it. And so I got them out of a hole, sort of several times. So the day after I was redundant, I rang them up and said, look, any freelance work you could let me have, I'd really appreciate it. And the guy in ops there said, God, you got us out of the trouble, so many times in the past. He said, we're going to try and fit you into the program. So I actually had about a month of freelance flying, which absolutely saved my life. It kept me airborne, it kept me current. And but coming towards the end of that month, one of the old chauffeur ops guys as well had got a new job with a company at Farnborough called Jet Club, and they came up with a requirement for a pilot on a short-term contract to fly a Citation Bravo, which was basically an upgraded glass cockpit version of the Citation 2. But it was to be based in Cannes in the south of France. So this guy rang me up from the office and said, do you fancy a short-term contract living in the south of France for a few months? And I said, well, who wouldn't? So off I went and lived in the south of France, and they provided an apartment. And the lovely thing about it was that all I was required to do was fly when they wanted me to. But the rest of the time was my own. So I had to be on call, and I had to stay within 2 hours drive of Cannes Airport. But apart from that, I was as free as a bird. It was brilliant. And there was one drawback to it. The chap that I was flying with, there were only two of us to fly this airplane, and the other chap was he was an ex French Navy Mirage pilot, and he was a bit. I'll be nice about this. He was quite excitable, put it that way. And he obviously didn't trust this Englishman who'd suddenly appeared in his midst. And he was quite, what shall I say, critical from the very first time we went flying. And he would get really excited and really sort of shout at me even sometimes. And after the first week, we'd done about 3 trips together, and it was getting a bit wearing. And I was thinking, I don't know if I can stand this. I might have to just resign and go home. But 2 things happened which saved the day, and one of them was that we were on a trip back into Cannes to land, and he was flying. And because Cannes, it's right on the coast, and it's it's in a valley or it's in a sort of like a bowl with the mountains around or the high hills around. And you have to fly a very precise approach because it's a mix of light aircraft, jet airplanes and helicopters. And so you have to fly a very, very accurate circuit with direction and height. And we'd come in to start the initial approach, and I'd done the approach checks. So you'll know this, Harvey, that when you're flying high, you're on a standard pressure setting, so that the main concern is that the aircraft stay apart from each other. As you get lower down to fly the approach, your main concern then is terrain clearance. So you change the pressure setting to the local pressure so that you know how high you are above the sea and above the airfield. So we'd done the approach checks, and part of the approach check is to set this pressure setting. And then we started downwind, and I looked at my altimeter and I noticed that we were about 150 feet too low. And I thought, that's a bit unusual. So I looked at my good friend Thierry, and I noticed that he'd somehow managed to press the button and reset standard pressure on his altimeter. So he was flying the wrong altitude. So I thought, well, I don't want to get him too excited. How can I, sort of put this across? So I very quietly and calmly said, you seem to have reverted to standard pressure, Thierry. And he looked at it and realized his mistake, quickly set the right pressure and then regained his altitude. But his attitude towards me, that I'd really helped him and that I'd really saved his bacon. And he was a lot nicer to me after that. And the other thing that happened a few days later, we were called out to do a charter to fly this passenger from Cannes up to Paris to catch a scheduled flight. Now, the problem with this was that it was a Swiss registered aeroplane. And having worked in ops and flight planning myself, I was aware of what they call the cabotage rules, which is that you cannot fly a foreign registered aircraft in your country just on a domestic flight within your country. So it was actually against the law to fly a Swiss aircraft just on a flight within France. So I pointed this out to Thierry, and he rang the main ops office up in Farnborough and said, we can't do this charter because it's against cabotage. And they said, just do it. Just, don't worry, who's going to know? And we said, well, look, actually, it's our responsibility here. If we get ramp checked in Paris, we're the ones in trouble. So Thierry said, no, I'm just refused. He flat refused to fly the trip. And I said to him, well, look, we come as a team. So, it's not just you that's in trouble with the company. We are in trouble with the company. So, we're in this together. And that really sort of cemented our relationship. And from that day on, we were the best of friends, and we flew together. It was great. And in the end, they offered me a full-time job, but I didn't accept it. But that was another story. But it was great. It was that few months I spent living down in Cannes, brilliant.
It sounds absolutely fantastic. And good to see you did some diplomatic work out there for the Anglo-French relationship.
Oh yeah, it was a real coup in the end. I mean, it was a real pleasure, and we were quite, I was sad to say goodbye to him at the end of it, So, and I've never seen him since, strangely enough.
Yeah.
But moving on from that, of course, we got back from that contract, and I was back in the UK, and again starting to root round for other jobs. Part of the problem I had was that I was fairly inexperienced as a pilot, even at that stage, but I was fairly advanced in years. So it wasn't a great combination. But in fact, it sort of played into my hands for the next job, because I was just mulling over what I could do when, again, out of the blue, I had a phone call from a certain lady called Andrea Lowndes. And
I think you've commented as well. So she is
right. So whatever I'm going to say now, Andrea, it's all true, okay? But she'd just been doing a freelance trip because after Chauffeur went bust, of course, Andrea and the other cabin crew, they were then freelancing for other companies. And she'd just done a freelance trip for a company called Sorven Aviation that operated a Falcon 50 based at Gloucester Airport. And it was a private operation owned by a private businessman, but they did charter work as well. So it was a good mix of private and charter flying. But she rang me up and said, on this trip, the pilots were mentioning that they were looking for another pilot, but they're not advertising in the press or anything. So she said, get your CV into this company, and she'd given me all the details. So got my CV in, and I went to have an interview with the chief pilot. And again, it's just the luck, you know. I know they say you make your own luck, but this just dropped in my lap. Now, he'd already interviewed several pilots, all of whom were young and really keen, and absolutely keen as mustard, wanting to really get on in life. The chief pilot was quite young in years himself. He was still in his 30s, so he was quite young to be a chief pilot. I came along and he interviewed me. Now, I was an older chap, certainly 10 years older than him. Not that experienced, but enough experience, to do the job. But I wasn't, all I wanted to do was fly airplanes. I didn't want to climb the slippery pole of management. I wasn't bothered about all that management stuff, which is exactly what he was looking for, because he did say to me afterwards that the other guys that he'd interviewed, he felt slightly intimidated and slightly threatened by them. Whereas, you can look at me, Harvey. Am I a threat to anybody? It turned out that, I was just what he was looking for. And there was another funny stroke of luck with that years before, when I worked in exec at Heathrow, you can imagine it was a manically busy office. We never had time for meal breaks, hardly had time for a cup of tea during the day sometimes. But there was a schoolboy who was a mad keen aircraft spotter. And he would ring up the office and say, oh, he's listening to the radio. What's that Learjet that's coming in? And want to chat about the airplanes we were handling. Now, some of the people in the office, they were they just got fed up with him and just some hang up on him or just be quite rude. And I always figured, well, he's always polite, and if I had a couple of minutes, I wasn't too busy, I'd give him the time of day and chat to him. It was quite a pleasant chap to chat to. Yeah. Or if I was busy, I'd say to him, look, give me a ring back at 6ish or something when it's quieter. And so, got on quite well with him. And then many years later, when I went for the interview for the Falcon, it was privately owned and based at Gloucester, but for the charter side of it and the operations side, it was managed by a company based at Farnborough called Executive Jet Charter. So they took care of, the pilot training, all the handling requirements, all the flight planning side of things. It just so happened that the managing director of that company, Executive Jet Charter, was that schoolboy. So, it's you never know what you give out in life, but think what you give out, I really believe comes back. And that was quite a nice little example of that. So yes, I fell into that job by this happy accident, and thanks to Andrea, of course, who I think I should sign up as my agent, really. She was also responsible for me getting into airability. But
that might be a good chat. Andrea needs some part in it.
Yeah.
But I'm so glad we've gone to talking about the Falcon 50. I think we've got some pictures if Chad can fish them out. But to me, I'm thinking that your career really came into fruition on these. That's a beautiful chat, I think. What was it like to fly?
It was fantastic. It's funny, actually, when Chauffeur went bust, and I then thought, I'm not going to fly an HS-125 again. I felt really quite sad about that. And in fact, that picture up there, that's not the Falcon 50, because within a year or so, the boss went out and bought a brand new Falcon 900, which he based again at Gloucester. And that was a dream of an airplane to fly. Absolutely fantastic. I can't believe it, how lucky I was to fly it. One of the really nice things about it is that it's got a limited range. It'll fly transatlantic, okay. So you could go, say, from Birmingham to New York, or you could go direct to Dubai or direct to Delhi or something like that. But it wouldn't fly for too long. Some of the modern airplanes now, like the Global Express or the Gulfstream 6, they'll fly for 14 hours. And I think, well, there's no way I want to fly an airplane for that long. So this aircraft, and it was not just a good range airplane for transatlantic, but it was really good on short range as well. It had such an excess of power. and fantastic brakes. You could land it on short runways. I landed that airplane at Blackbush once, actually, when we couldn't get a slot into Farnborough, and that brought the spotters out. It was really good.
I mean, it does look stunning. And so I said of it that the bulk of your career was at flying. Talk us through this briefly. And we got a few pictures coming up. I think there's a lady let out the window of a building, and I know there's a story behind it.
Well, yes, that was actually the best country that I ever went to. I think it was the country of Bhutan up in the Himalayas, and it's the country it's a monarchy, but the king declared that they don't consider the most important thing to be a gross national product. He put great importance on gross national happiness, and it's the most giving and happy society that I've ever experienced. And there's nobody in the country who's particularly rich, and there's nobody in the country who's poor. Everybody genuinely really does look out for everybody else, and share what they have. And that's it. That's the main airport terminal building, and it was an absolute joy to fly there. The approach was the most demanding approach I've ever been involved in. We had to go up to British Aerospace in Manchester and spend a day flying the simulator, because they had the approach for this airfield built into the simulator, and we had to practice, because the difficulty with the approach was that you start off by getting the weather brief, and up the end of the valley there's a mountain top that's called Confluence, and we were flying up there from Delhi, and so we were at Delhi in the ops office, rang the tower at Bhutan at Paro and said, "What's the weather?" And then the air traffic control man looks up the valley and he can see the mountain top at Confluence, and his weather report is Confluence is clear. And if you hear that from him, then you're good to go and fly up there and fly the approach. So off we went, and you come over the airfield at about, I think the minimum safe altitude is 23,000 feet. And you come overhead the airfield, and it's down in the bottom of a valley. Oh, this is the approach, yeah. Our flight attendant, Trish, she filmed it over my shoulder. So we're following a river valley here. And the airfield elevation is nearly 8,000 feet above sea level. And there is no room to build an airport in Bhutan where you can have an unobstructed approach. You have to fly over various bluffs to get in there. So you descend over the airfield and fly up to the valley past the end of the airfield, descend again, come back over the airfield, descending again, and eventually till you get to this point where we're about 1,000 feet above the river and following the river valley down. And you'll notice we're quite low on the approach already here, but we still yet can't see the airfield. And we have to fly over a bluff, and on the top of the bluff, you can actually see it just where the arrow's pointing there. There's a thing called a house, and it's known universally as Mr. Smith's house. And you have to fly over Mr. Smith's house at 200 feet. And once you've cleared his house, you've then got to do a bit of a sort of a dirty dive down to the runway. So it's not a stable approach by any means. And it's a very, very exciting approach to fly. So now you're just getting the view of the runway. Here we come up over Mr. Smith's house. And it was a real privilege to be able to fly in there.
It looks like a great approach. Did you look forward to the challenge of it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, to be able to get to do, you want to cut the film off now because it all goes to a bit of a mess at this point. She dropped the camera just after we touched down. Yeah, I mean, various places we flew to. We used to fly to Sion in Switzerland, and that was an interesting approach to fly. Again, you know, down in the bottom of a valley with mountains all around. It certainly, you know, keeps you sharp and keeps you awake. And in fact, we used to go up to northern Denmark a lot. The boss used to go to a little town called Skagen, and we spent quite a bit of time up there privately with the boss. and we used to land on an airstrip there called Sindal. Again, which is only about 3,500 feet runway. So it concentrates the mind, when you've got short runways or obstructed approaches. So I feel very lucky to have been able to fly some of these things.
The scenery, especially that, it's breathtaking, really. And over your years, you flew with the stars, and obviously the world's great and the good. Did you ever get to party with them at all?
Well, yeah, occasionally. I mean, we used to do some of the big pop groups doing sort of when they're on tour. So people like Elton John, we'd fly him around when he was on a European tour. And he actually would always want to come back to the UK straight after the concert if he could. So very often we'd be, somewhere in Europe. He'd come off stage, come straight to the airfield, onto the aircraft, and we'd fly him. The only airfield that was open in the London area at that time of night was Heathrow. So we'd fly into Heathrow at around midnight or so. He'd go off home, and then the next day we'd reposition out to Farnborough to do the next bit of the trip. So that was quite complicated. And we flew Paul McCartney quite a lot as well with his band. So that was a very cost-effective way of getting the band around. And if we were on the ground and staying overnight, then the crew were generally invited to go to the concert, as the guests of the band. So that was, it was just amazing. We always had fantastic seats. But the last trip we did with Paul McCartney, we landed back in the UK from somewhere, and they had a few days off then. And Paul McCartney was great with the crew. We always got on very, very well with them, and he was always very nice to me. He stopped back. Normally he'd get off the airplane into his car and off he'd go home or wherever. But he actually hung back one evening and collared me in the cabin, and he'd said, I'd just like to say thank you for looking after us so well on this tour. He said, the crew are really taking good care of us. And he said, we really do appreciate it. And I said, well, we get a real buzz out of it as well. You take care of us, really. And I mentioned, I said my wife is a massive Beatles fan right back from the 60s. So with that, he said, oh, well, look, we're playing the O2 on Monday. He said, why don't you bring your wife as my guest? So what do you say? It was just absolutely amazing, because when I got home, my wife was very, very thrilled, of course. So sure enough, bearing in mind that, you know the old newsreel films when you see the screaming girls on the airport roof screaming at the Beatles when they're getting off their aeroplane. Well, my wife was one of those girls up there. She really was a real Beatles fan, as our son Paul would tell you as well, although she says there's no connection with that. But anyway, off we went to the O2, went to this VIP desk. Sure enough, nice little envelope, VIP passes in there. Went and found our seats, had a fantastic concert. It was just incredible. And then we drove home afterwards. And the next morning, I was just downstairs making the breakfast, and I was clearing out my jacket pockets, and I found this envelope where the tickets had been. And then I found this little slip of paper inside the envelope giving us directions to the backstage party. So I thought, should I tell her? And in the end, I thought, well, I'm going to have to. If I don't, it's going to slip out at some stage or other. So she'd missed her chance to actually go to the party and meet him. But that was completely down to me. Anyway, that's life. She still enjoyed the concert anyway.
She did. I bet you still were in her good books for quite a while after that. I'm going to replace one of my questions now with a question from Rachel Watson, because I think she's phrased it a bit better than I have, and that is, what is your best career moment? And I like her, she did also clarify, so this can be bad or good, because of bad things can also lead to the best moments.
Well, I have to say, I suppose that the most memorable moment of my entire life, I suppose, was flying the Queen, and it was almost like a really surreal experience. We were tasked to fly Her Majesty from Northolt up to Aberdeen, and then she was going on. It was in July, about this time of year, and she was going on holiday to Balmoral. And I was I was, what should we say, the junior member of the team. I was sort of briefed, by the equerries to sort of, you stay in the cockpit, look out of the window, don't talk to anybody, and just keep out of the way. So that's fine, no problem at all. And so the Queen came on board, and uneventful flight. One of the funny things was, because you get a special royal call sign. The Queen's call sign is Kitty Hawk. So we were airborne and on our way up, flying up to, and it was a bit of a zigzag route up the country, sort of Birmingham, then Manchester, and then Edinburgh. And so I thought, well, I'll ask air traffic and see, you always ask for shortcuts with air traffic. So I said to this air traffic controller, I was Kitty Hawk, any chance we could go direct to Edinburgh? And this chap came straight back. He said, oh, my dear chap, he said, you can go wherever you like, he said. So sure enough, straight line to Edinburgh. And off we went. That was quite a funny moment. But when we landed, of course, there's a big flurry. Everybody's rushing around to try and get the bags sorted out and get the limousines lined up. And so, and the captain that I was flying with, he jumped out of his seat to go down to stand with the equerries and that sort of thing. So the only people left in the airplane were myself and the Queen. And so I was busy in the cockpit. I wasn't really aware of what was going on. But then I looked around and she was standing right by me. Waiting in the doorway because her limousine hadn't quite pulled round yet, so she didn't go down the stairs. And she was just beaming at me, smiling. And she said, she said, I really do love this time of year. She said, I'm going on my summer holiday now. So I felt a little bit like a rabbit in the headlights, but I thought, well, she's spoken to me. So I said, well, I hope you have a really wonderful holiday, Your Majesty. And she absolutely, her face lit up. And she beamed as though I'd done something really nice for her, And she said, oh, thank you so much, she said. And with that, she swept and went on her holiday. And I was sitting there thinking, did that really just happen? And so that was, I suppose, the absolute high spot, of my flying career. It doesn't get any better than that.
It definitely doesn't, and I guess that answers the question, what is your proudest moment, because what a privilege.
Well, I've got to pay tribute to my wife here as well, because she was always into floristry and all sorts of garden designing and all sorts of stuff like that. And the night before the trip, Denise, our hostess, she rang me up and said, would Jane do a flower arrangement for the cabin of the aeroplane? And of course, poor old Jane, she flew into an absolute panic. We went rushing off down to the florist's, and I got an old sort of round basket that was hanging up in the shed, and we made an oasis. And she did this beautiful display, which we then put into the cabin on the aeroplane. And as the Queen was getting up to leave, she said to Denise, she said, I'll take this if that's all right. This will look beautiful in Balmoral. And she took Jane's floral display off to Balmoral with her. So I thought that was a real feather in the cap for my wife as well.
Yeah. That is awesome. I mean, what a great experience.
Yeah.
I think the thing that really stands out is you treat everyone the same with kindness regardless of who they are. Yeah. I think that's where that great reaction came from, because no matter who you are, you need a bit of kindness. So what brought your executive jet flying to an end?
Yeah, that was quite sad, actually. That my boss is a chap called Philip Sorensen, and he was a fantastic guy to work for, a really, really lovely man. And he died, and he was quite young. I mean, he was only about 71 when he died, I think. And so his family then inherited all his assets, And the family never really used his private jet. I mean, I remember in the eulogy at his funeral, his son referred to the airplane as his dad's, expensive toy. And I think that's kind of how they viewed it. So we had a feeling that our days were a little bit numbered, but we carried on operating through executive jet charter. So we still did charter work. And in fact, we made enough money with chartering to cover the costs of the airplane. So it was, we weren't a drain on the resources. The only thing we couldn't cover the cost of was the depreciation of the airplane itself. But certainly operating costs, we made a profit. So we were kind of hoping that we'd be left alone and just carry on chartering. And we did high profile stuff like the royal family, like all the big pop groups, some very rich business people who used us. And we had a very good reputation for customer service. So people that flew with us once, they wanted us, back again. I mean, in fact, we did a lot of flying for Tony Blair, in this Middle Eastern envoy sort of role that he had. And we did a lot of flying for him. And he would ring up and it's basically we would be the first choice. If we weren't available, then they'd go on to other operators to fulfill the role. But but it wasn't to be. We carried on for 2 years after the boss had died, but then the family put the aircraft up for sale, and there again I was back out of a job. And it was just at the same moment when the market was very difficult for pilots, because there was a very large company called NetJets, and that they, at the very same moment that we were selling our airplane, they made 160 of their pilots redundant. So the market was absolutely flooded with executive jet pilots. So it was quite difficult, especially by then I was getting on a bit. I was actually getting close to the 65 year, because at 65, you can't fly public transport any longer. So, and I was getting a bit close to that. So, nobody was going to employ me being so close to that age for public transport work. But anyway, I did a little bit of freelance work. But that was at the point when I fell into airability.
It is. I was about to say it. It's so bad because I think 2012 you came for a cup of tea.
Yeah.
You haven't left since. What have you been up to with us for so long?
That started out again, another phone call from that lovely lady, Andrea Lowndes, who was working with airability on a voluntary basis. And she said, just pop in, have a cup of tea, 10 minutes. And that was, as you say, in 2012. And I popped in for a cup of tea and I haven't left. But Mike Miller-Smith made some sort of noises about the possibility of me renewing my instructor's rating, which I hadn't used in 20 years. But he then, again, going back to my good old friend Tim Orchard, it was Mike Miller-Smith that brought Tim Orchard in. And I got, again, a phone call out of the blue. And Tim said to me, right, get yourself down to Blackbush tomorrow morning, as early as you like. He said, we're going to go flying, and then I'm going to sign up your instructor's rating. And then we did some ground school, we did a bit of studying, and sure enough, within a week, I'd done my testing, and there I had my instructor's rating back. And my feet didn't touch the floor. And I have to say, instructing with airability has been another of the joys of my life. It's hard to express. Well, I mean, I've flown with you, Harvey, haven't I? To sit there and watch somebody develop. And especially when somebody gets in an airplane and they say, I can't do this. And, after a little bit of encouragement and, trying, they find, you find you can do it. And it's fantastic. It's just brilliant.
It is. And I think from my point of view, I started flying with you for a little while, really, and it was at a time where my future PPL was pretty uncertain, and I think I just fed off your enthusiasm for aviation. It's brilliant. And I think you only told me off once, which was pretty good going as well. So you did, but we got some. It was good because I've never forgotten what you said at that moment. But we got some pictures coming up of the Cherokee 6.
Yeah.
So tell us about this. There's one with the door off as well.
Oh, there was, yeah. Well, of course, the National Air Traffic Service, they actually sponsored and bought an airplane for us, a Technam single-engined aircraft. You had a picture of it up there a little bit earlier. The door-off incident was when we flew down to the Aero Expo down at Friedrichshafen, and we took delivery of the Technam, and so we flew back in formation all the way from Friedrichshafen back to Blackbush. But we stopped off in Latuke to get some fuel and have a bit of a pee and that sort of thing and refuel. And they decided, Guy Westgate, who's very well known to airability, decided that he wanted to get some unobstructed air-to-air shots. So we took the door off the Cherokee 6 and very, very strongly strapped Guy in the doorway and took off, and we flew across the channel. And Guy took so many pictures and did some movie and that sort of thing. There he is in the doorway there, yeah. And I was flying the Cherokee 6, and James Brown, one of our old instructors, he was flying in the right-hand seat with me. So he was doing the radio. And as we taxied out at Latuke, James was talking to him, and we got to the end of the runway and said, okay, we're ready for departure. And the controller came straight back on. He said, oh, Hotel Kilo, Fox Kilo. He says, your door. He said, he's open. I mean, and James just very quiet. He just said, yeah, that's fine. Okay, thanks. So ready for departure. No, you don't understand. Your door is not there. He said, okay, thanks a lot. Ready for departure. And in the end, after 3 attempts, this controller said, okay, clear takeoff. And off we went, But it was fine. It was great. It was a great trip. And we got some really good photographs out of it. But the other picture you showed there just now, that was a trip we did. There's the Technam. And that was at a little airfield called Gruyere, just off the end of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And we did there's an organization called Handy Flight based in Switzerland. And they invited us to go there for a week's flying. And it was just really, again, another joy. We were flying around the Alps. We did a little trip into Sion, and we did various cross-country flights. We went up to the top of, I flew with one chap up to the top of Mont Blanc just to have a look. It was, the opportunities that we've had to do some really good stuff. It's great.
Yeah, I think everything's been there. The thing airability has taught me is anything is possible.
Yeah.
It really is.
Old Brian Catchpole landing at Sion, yeah. And because this is where we used to go in the Falcon 900 as well. So it was just going back to the old haunts for me. He did a good job, Brian. That was quite a demanding approach for him to fly. And it worked out really well.
It's a lovely place. I'm moving on a little bit. You have also been involved with Project Propeller. Tell us a bit about them and why you got involved.
Yes, it's funny. I read about them some years ago, and it's an organisation that they go out to people around the country, to pilots around the country who are prepared to provide an aeroplane and their time. And we get as many World War II veterans into private aircraft and fly into a designated airport somewhere in the middle of the country where they have a day having a big reunion and a big party. And then in the afternoon, we fly them all home again. And I had thought some years ago, oh, yeah, I'd really like to get involved with that. So, and then, of course, it just got put on one side until I got a phone call from a chap who was doing it from Blackbush. And his wife had been taken into hospital within a few days of Project Propeller. So he asked me if I'd take it over. And I met up with 3 of these veterans on that day and got on really well with them. And I ended up not just doing the annual trip to for the party and the reunions, but I would take them on trips, other than that as well. I took 3 chaps up to East Kirby, where they're restoring one of the Lancasters, and they had a tour around the aircraft and saw it taxiing around the airfield. And then one of the old chaps said to me one day, he really would like to go up and visit the Bomber Command Memorial at Lincoln. And when I looked, the nearest airfield to get there was Waddington. So I contacted the ops department there, who told me to go away and not bother them. Of course, you can't land a private airplane at Waddington. So through the Aircrew Association and the Air Force, it went up as high as High Wycombe, where the group captain at High Wycombe, who was involved in the Aircrew Association, rang the station commander at Waddington and said, look, let these chaps come. They've paid their dues. So sure enough, we took the Cherokee 6, and good old Claire Tonkinson, she came with me. And between the 2 of us, we flew up to Waddington. And we landed there. And to be fair to the RAF, they treated us like absolute royalty. And they were all ex-bomber crew from the Second World War. One of them had been a prisoner of war. And they were taken to the memorial, given lunch, and had an absolutely glorious day. So to me, it's again a real privilege to work with these chaps, it's a shame in lockdown that it's curtailed a lot of the activities now, but I'm sure we'll pick it up again. Because they're a dwindling population now. We've lost, I think, 3 of them in the last year. So I want to do as much as we can with those remaining while we can, really.
Yeah, it is really a brilliant thing to do, and we can't, and I don't think we will ever forget the sacrifices that they made for us.
Yeah.
With flying, which back in those days was fairly primitive without being shot at. Yeah, it was just an extra thing, and the incredible bravery. So we won't ever forget that.
No, the other thing that strikes me about them, though, is that they're in the 90s now, and it's this. They still, to a man and woman, they have this zest for life, and it's a bit like old Tom Moore, who's getting his knighthood tomorrow. The men of that spirit, they're so to be respected, and I feel it's a privilege to to be in their company.
Definitely. And we are running short on time, but the last thing I want to ask you about is definitely there's that new venture you have away from aviation, and that's as a TV extra. How's that going?
Well, actually, it's come to a dead stop for the moment. Of course, a lot of the filming has been stopped and curtailed since lockdown, and that's worldwide, of course. So there's not a lot in the offing at the moment. But no, I've had several, and it's been good fun. I did get a little part in a Netflix series called The Crown. Oddly enough, playing the part of a pilot. It was really good fun. I just thought one day I'd heard of somebody I knew that did a bit of film extra work, and I just thought, sounds a fun thing to do. And I just Googled it. How do you become an extra? Signed up with various agencies, and I get the occasional call. So I've done that was the main one. I was flying a Piper Chieftain into the island of Mustique when flying Princess Margaret in there. So I'm only very briefly on the screen, but it was a day's filming, and it was good. I got to meet Helena Bonham Carter, who was very nice. It's good fun. And I made another film. I made another film. No, I spent a weekend filming up in London, and it was actually a French film about when Charles de Gaulle, at the beginning of the Second World War, when he escaped from France and came over to seek the support of Churchill for the Free French Army. So I played a man in suit in the street. But I did get to hold open the door of Broadcasting House for Charles de Gaulle to walk through. So
that's claim to fame that not many
Absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. Well, a quick look at the comments before we go, I think.
I dread to think, yeah.
Be careful how I say the first name. So it's Mr. Clucking Chickens. But he said my dad, who's John Clare, flew a Project Propeller to York, which is incredible. We've also a bit higher up got a question to see if you still know any aircraft part suppliers. But just general love for you, Nick. I think you've done a good job in inspiring the viewers today. And a lot of hellos and a lot of people listening keenly. So to the viewers, this will still be on Air Ability's YouTube channel forever now. So be sure to carry on sharing it and pointing people to this bit of inspiration on this now a bit of a sunny Thursday afternoon. Thank you so much, Nick, allowing me to talk to you. It's just every time we talk, I learn something different about you. And we really do appreciate your efforts with their ability. And what an amazing career you've had. And you have definitely earned it as well. So thank you to everyone involved, Nick, and also Chad, working behind the scenes, and also the viewers for watching. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Right. Thanks very much.